Hello listener. If you're hearing this, you're still breathing air that sees sunlight. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. What I'm about to tell you is the darkest story I know. This isn't about climbing to safety or finding high ground. This is about descending into darkness so absolute, so complete, that you forget what color looks like. About choosing a bunker designed to survive the end of the world and learning that survival and burial are sometimes indistinguishable. About spending 240 days in a concrete tomb where every breath might be your last. Where every sound is a potential system failure. Where the only company is your own fracturing mind. My name is Marcus Chen. And before the world caught fire and died screaming, I was a private security contractor specializing in what I called industrial archaeology. That's a pretentious way of saying I got paid to babysit abandoned government facilities that were too expensive to demolish and too politically complicated to sell off. My specialty was Cold War infrastructure, the kind of massive, over-engineered military installations that were built when nuclear annihilation seemed inevitable and budgets were unlimited. Radar stations buried in mountains, communication bunkers carved into bedrock, supply depots that could withstand direct hits from Soviet missiles, and my personal favorite, decommissioned nuclear missile silos. People don't realize how many of these things are scattered across the American West. During the height of the Cold War, the United States built over 1,000 ICBM launch facilities, massive underground complexes designed to house nuclear-tipped missiles that would deliver apocalypse to the Soviet Union if the order ever came. Each silo was essentially a small military base buried in the earth. Launch control centers with blast doors measured in tons. Living quarters for crews who might have to survive underground for months. Environmental systems designed to filter out radiation, chemical agents, biological weapons, backup generators that could run for years. Water storage measured in tens of thousands of gallons. These weren't just holes in the ground with missiles in them. They were fortresses, underground cities built for the single purpose of surviving the unthinkable. Starting in the early 1990s, after the Cold War ended and arms reduction treaties were signed, the military started decommissioning these sites. The missiles were removed. The launch equipment was disabled or destroyed per treaty obligations. And then came the question of what to do with the facilities themselves. Some were filled with concrete, some were sold to private buyers who turned them into survival retreats or data centers, but many were just locked up and forgotten, too remote to attract interest, too expensive to maintain, too politically sensitive to advertise for sale. That's where people like me came in. The government contracted security firms to maintain minimal oversight on these abandoned sites, make sure transients hadn't broken in, verify that environmental systems were preventing groundwater intrusion that could contaminate check that control systems had been properly disabled, file quarterly reports that nobody read, and make sure nothing embarrassing happened that would end up on the news. I'd been doing this work for 8 years. Started in my mid-20s, fresh out of a brief and unsuccessful attempt at college, looking for any job that paid decent money and didn't require much human interaction. Found a posting for security contractors needed for remote site monitoring. Applied, got hired. Discovered I was weirdly suited for it. Most people couldn't handle the isolation, the loneliness of spending weeks at remote facilities with nothing but wind and sagebrush for company. Drove them back to civilization within months. But I thrived. Loved the solitude, the profound quiet, the sense of being disconnected from the noise and chaos of normal life. My territory covered 6 sites scattered across Montana and Wyoming. I'd make monthly rotations, visiting each site for 3 to 5 days, performing inspections, doing basic maintenance, filing reports. The pay was good, the work was easy, and I spent most of my time alone in some of the most interesting abandoned architecture in the country. Site J27 was my favorite posting, and the one that would eventually save my life. A Titan II missile silo located about 40 miles north of Great Falls, Montana, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. The nearest town was 20 miles away. The nearest paved road was 12 miles. The site sat in rolling grassland where you could see for 30 miles in every direction, surrounded by nothing but sage, grass, occasional cattle, and endless sky. The silo had been built in 1962 during the peak of Cold War paranoia. The Titan II was the largest land-based ICBM the United States ever deployed. 9 megatons of thermonuclear destructive power, range of over 6,000 miles. A single Titan II could obliterate an entire Soviet city and leave a radioactive crater a mile wide. Each silo cost roughly $15 million to build in $1,962. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $150 million in current money. For one missile, the United States built 54 of them, J-27s. Missile had been removed in 1984 when the Titan II program was retired. The launch systems had been disabled in 1987. Official decommissioning happened in 1994. For the past 30 years, the site had just sat there, slowly deteriorating, maintained by contractors like me who checked in monthly to make sure nothing catastrophic was happening. I'd been the primary contractor for J-27 for 6 years. I knew every inch of that facility, knew which stairs creaked, which doors stuck, which systems still functioned and which had failed decades ago. I'd spent probably 200 nights there over those 6 years, sleeping in the old crew quarters, exploring maintenance tunnels, reading by flashlight in rooms designed to withstand nuclear war. The facility was massive. The main silo shaft was 150 feet deep and 50 feet in diameter, lined with reinforced concrete 6 feet thick. The underground control center and support spaces added another 8 levels of rooms, tunnels, equipment areas, and storage. Total interior space was probably 12,000 square feet spread across multiple levels reaching 200 feet below the surface at the deepest point. The entire complex was topped with a blast door that weighed 740 tons and could seal the facility against anything short of a direct nuclear strike. I'd always thought, in the back of my mind, that if the world ever really did end, J-27 would be the place to be. It was designed for exactly that scenario, built to keep a crew alive through nuclear war and the radioactive aftermath, self-sufficient for months, defensible, remote, perfect. When the news started showing violent attacks in Seattle and Portland in early June 2024, when reports of spreading infection and overwhelmed hospitals dominated every channel, when I heard the word zombie used non-ironically on national news, my brain immediately went to J-27. I was at my apartment in Great Falls when the emergency broadcasts started. June 14, 2024, a Friday afternoon. I'd been planning a routine site visit to J-27 the following Monday. Instead, I started packing. Not for a 3-day inspection. For permanent relocation, I cleaned out my savings account, hit every store in Great Falls that was still open, bought food, water, batteries, medical supplies, tools, propane, everything I could think of, loaded my truck until the suspension groaned, made 3 trips back to my apartment, hauling up supplies, organizing them, planning the move. By Saturday morning, June 15th, the situation in Great Falls was deteriorating visibly. Grocery stores were being looted. Gas stations had lines around the block. Police sirens were constant. I saw my first infected person that morning while loading the truck. A man stumbling down the sidewalk with that characteristic wrong motion. Gray skin, mouth hanging open, eyes that didn't track properly. He walked past me like I wasn't there, following some internal compass I couldn't perceive. I finished loading, locked my apartment for the last time, drove north out of Great Falls on Highway 87, watching the city shrink in my rearview mirror. The 40 miles to J-27 took me through increasingly empty country. Small towns that looked abandoned, cars parked at odd angles, no traffic on the roads. The radio stations were playing emergency broadcasts on loop. Shelter in place. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Help is coming. I turned off the highway onto the dirt access road, 12 miles from the site. The road was rough, barely maintained, meant only for service vehicles. My truck bounced over ruts and washouts, kicking up dust that hung in the still air behind me. The silo complex appeared on the horizon, as a low concrete bunker rising slightly above the grassland, marked by the radio antenna that still stood next to it, and the massive circular blast door housing that looked like a low concrete dome. From a distance, you'd drive past it thinking it was just another agricultural building or abandoned ranch structure. You wouldn't know that beneath that innocent surface sat one of the most sophisticated military facilities ever built. I'd pulled up to the chain link fence that surrounded the site. The gate was locked with my padlock. I unlocked it, drove through, relocked it behind me, drove up to the main entrance of the control center, killed the engine, stepped out into Montana, silence. The wind whispered through the grass. The antenna creaked slightly. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark sang. That was it. No traffic sounds, no aircraft, no human noise at all. I looked back south toward Great Falls, could see the city as a smudge on the horizon, smoke rising from multiple points. Even 40 miles away, I could see that things were getting worse. I turned to the control center entrance. A heavy steel door set into the concrete bunker. Above it, faded letters. Titan to launch facility J27. I pulled out my key ring, found the correct key, unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Stale air, concrete, dust, machine oil. The smell of Cold War infrastructure. The smell of home. I stepped inside and began the process of moving into my underground fortress. The control center had two main access points to the underground levels. The primary route was a stairwell that descended from the surface building down through all 8 levels, with landings every 20 feet. The secondary route was an elevator shaft that ran parallel to the stairs. Though the elevator itself had been disabled years ago, I chose the stairs for moving supplies, began hauling boxes and bags and containers from the truck, down the first flight to landing 1, down the second flight to landing 2. Each landing had a heavy blast door that could be sealed, creating multiple barriers between surface and the deepest levels. Most were rusted open, frozen in place from decades of neglect, but a few still functioned. The stairs were steep and narrow. Each load I carried down left me breathing hard, legs burning. I was in decent shape from hiking and general maintenance work, but I wasn't prepared for moving literally tons of supplies down 8 levels of stairs. I worked all day Saturday, made maybe 40 trips up and down. By evening, I'd moved about half my supplies to level 3, which I'd chosen as my primary living area. Level 3 had the old crew quarters, a small kitchen area, and was centrally located with quick access to both upper and lower levels. I spent Saturday night in my truck, too exhausted to do more. Ate cold beans from a can, watched the sun set over the grassland, saw more smoke on the southern horizon. Great Falls was burning. Sunday, June 16th, I finished moving supplies, got everything underground. Then I began the real work, activating the facility's systems. The control center had been designed for a crew of 4 to operate around the clock during periods of high alert. The facility could theoretically support that crew for 6 months without resupply. To do that, it had sophisticated life support systems, air handlers that could filter out nuclear fallout, chemical weapons, biological agents, water purification and storage, backup power generation, CO2 scrubbing. The work stopped. Most of these systems had been offline for decades, but they'd been built to military specifications in the 1960s when over-engineering was standard. Built to last, built to survive. Many of them would still work if I could get power to them. The facility had 3 power sources. Primary power had come from the electrical grid, but those lines had been cut decades ago. Secondary power was backup generators, massive diesel engines with fuel tanks holding 5,000 gallons. Tertiary power was battery banks that could maintain essential systems for 72 hours if both grid and generators failed. The generators were my target. If I could get them running, I could power the air handlers, water pumps, lights, everything. I spent Sunday afternoon in the generator room on level 5. The room was huge, maybe 40 feet square, dominated by 2 diesel generators the size of cars. They were filthy, covered in dust and cobwebs and rat droppings, but they were intact. I'd done basic generator maintenance during my security visits over the years, enough to keep them from completely seizing up, but I'd never actually tried to run them for extended periods. This was going to be a test. I started with the fuel system, checked the tanks, still had maybe 3,000 gallons, checked the fuel lines intact but needed bleeding, checked the filters clogged with decades of sediment, replaced them with spares I found in the supply room. Then the engine itself, changed oil, replaced filters, cleaned fuel injectors, checked electrical connections, tested the starter batteries dead, replaced them with new batteries I'd brought. By evening, I was ready to try starting generator 1. I hit the starter. The engine turned over slowly, coughed, died. I tried again. More coughing, a puff of black smoke from the exhaust. Then it caught. The diesel roar filled the generator room, echoing off concrete walls. I watched the control panel. Oil pressure came up. Temperature started rising. Voltage output climbed. The generator was running. I let it warm up for 10 minutes, then started throwing breakers, connecting the generator output to the facility's electrical distribution system. Lights came on throughout the control center for the first time in decades. Fluorescent tubes flickering to life. Equipment panels lighting up. The elevator attempting to run before I shut it back down. The facility was alive again. I activated the air handlers next. Huge fans on level 4 that pulled surface air down through intake shafts, pushed it through HEPA filters, scrubbed out CO2 with chemical beds, and circulated it through the facility. They groaned and rattled when they started. decades of dust and debris shaking loose. But they ran. Water pumps came online, lights throughout the facility, heating systems that would keep the deep levels from getting to cold. By Monday morning, June 17th, I had a functioning underground base. Power, air, water, light, everything I needed. Now, I just had to seal myself inside. The main entrance to the control center was protected by the massive blast door, minus 740 tons of steel and concrete mounted on rails, designed to slide across the entrance and seal the facility against nuclear weapons. During normal operations, the door stayed open, but it could be closed and sealed from inside using hydraulic systems powered by the generators. I'd tested the blast door before, during inspections, but I'd never actually sealed it with me inside. That felt different. Final. Like closing the lid on my own coffin. Monday afternoon, I stood at the control panel for the blast door, took a deep breath, hit the activation switch. The hydraulics engaged with a deep mechanical groan that vibrated through the entire facility. The blast door started moving on its rails, slowly, inches per minute. The door was so massive that even with full hydraulic pressure, it took nearly 10 minutes to close completely. I watched through the narrowing gap as the Montana grassland disappeared from view, sunshine, blue sky, sage, wind, the outside world. The door sealed with a boom that I felt in my chest. The entrance was now blocked by 8 tons of blast-proof barrier. Nothing was getting in, and nothing was getting out without significant effort. I stood in the sudden silence, my ears ringing from the mechanical noise, looked around at the concrete walls lit by fluorescent lights, breathed recycled air being pushed through vents above my head. This was my new reality. 200 feet of earth and concrete between me and the surface. Self-sufficient systems, enough supplies for months. Complete isolation. I was safe. Completely safe. I was also completely alone. Day one of my underground life started when I woke up on June 18th in the crew quarters on level 3. I'd made up one of the old bunks with sheets and blankets I'd brought. Slept surprisingly well despite the constant mechanical hum of the generators and air handlers. I established a routine immediately. Structure was going to be essential for maintaining sanity during long-term isolation. I'd read about Antarctic research stations, submarine crews, solo sailors. Everyone emphasized the importance of routine. 600 wake up, 630 system checks, walk through all levels, verify all equipment is functioning correctly, note any anomalies in the log I'd started. 730 breakfast in the small kitchen area on level 30830 maintenance work. There was always something to clean, adjust, repair. 1200 lunch, 1300 exercise. I'd walk laps around level 3, do push-ups and sit-ups, climb stairs between levels. Staying fit was critical. 1500 free time, reading, mostly. I'd brought maybe 30 books. 1800, dinner. 1900 radio monitoring. I'd scan frequencies looking for any broadcasts, any information about what was happening on the surface. 2100 write in my journal, document the day. 2200 sleep. The routine helped, gave each day structure, purpose, prevented the time from becoming a formless blur. The facility itself was fascinating to explore in detail. Each level had distinct purposes. Level 1 depth, 20 feet, primary security and control. This level had the main control room where launch operations would have been coordinated. Rows of old consoles, dusty panels with switches and indicators, communication equipment, security systems. Most of it was defunct, but some panels still lit up when powered. Level 2 depth, 40 feet command staff quarters. For small rooms, each barely bigger than a prison cell. A bunk, a small desk, a locker, a single chair. Everything designed for function over comfort. This level also had a small medical bay with examination table, medicine cabinets, basic surgical tools, all vintage 1960s equipment. Level 3 depth, 60 feet, crew quarters and common areas. 8 more small sleeping rooms for the enlisted personnel who would have operated the facility. A small kitchen with commercial-grade appliances, a rec room with a TV that no longer worked and some battered furniture, a bathroom with showers and toilets connected to a septic system that still functioned. Level 4 depth, 80 feet environmental systems. The air handlers were here, massive units that processed all the facility's air. Also the CO2 scrubbers, chemical beds that removed carbon dioxide from the recycled air, water filtration and pumping equipment, climate control systems. This level was hot from all the running equipment and loud from the fans and motors. Level 5 depth, 100 feet power generation. The 2 diesel generators lived here along with their fuel tanks. Also the battery banks, rows of industrial batteries the size of refrigerators that provided backup power. A workshop area with tools and spare parts. Fuel storage beyond the main tanks. Level 6 depth, 120 feet. Launch control and equipment interfaces. This level had the systems that used to connect to the missile in the silo. Most of it had been removed or disabled during decommissioning, but you could still see where equipment had been mounted, where cables had run, where the actual launch controls had been installed. Level 7 depth, 140 feet silo access and maintenance. This level connected to the actual missile silo itself, the 150-foot deep 50-foot diameter shaft where the Titan II had sat. A large blast door separated the control center from the silo. The silo access door was sealed and I'd never opened it. Beyond would be the silo shaft, empty now, except for maintenance platforms and the ghosts of a weapon system designed to end the world. Level 8 depth, 200 feet, deepest maintenance and emergency systems. The bottom level was a maze of small tunnels and equipment rooms, emergency backup systems, cable runs, pipe chasers, a small room that might have been a last resort shelter if the rest of the facility was compromised, access to the underground water table that fed the facility's wells. Total usable space was enormous, maybe 12,000 square feet. For one person, it was like living in a small office building alone. Whole sections I never visited, rooms that stayed dark, equipment that never got used. The first week, I focused on optimizing the systems. The generators were burning fuel faster than I'd like. At current consumption, my 3,000 gallons would last maybe 60 days. I needed to reduce power draw. I started shutting down non-essential systems. Lights in sections I wasn't using. The heating system, the deep underground temperature, was naturally around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool but livable without heating. The elevator had never worked anyway. Communication systems I didn't need. Anything that drew power but wasn't critical for survival. By the end of week 1, I'd cut power consumption by about 40%. Fuel would now last maybe 90 days. Still not great, but better. The air handlers were my biggest concern. They were essential. Without them, the CO2 from my breathing would build up and eventually suffocate me. But they were also old, complex, lots of moving parts that could fail. The system worked like this. Surface air came down through intake shafts, got pulled through HEPA filters to remove particles, dust, potential radiation, then went through the CO2 scrubbers chemical beds that absorbed carbon dioxide, then got pushed through the facility by fans, exited through exhaust shafts back to the surface. The weak point was the CO2 scrubbers. The chemical beds had a limited lifespan. They'd absorb CO2 until they were saturated, then needed replacement. During normal operations with a 4-person crew, the beds would last about 6 months. With just me, they'd last longer, maybe a year, but I had no idea how old the current beds were. They could have been in place for decades, slowly accumulating CO2 even with the facility shut down, just from air exchange. They could fail tomorrow or last another year. No way to know. I found spare scrubber beds in storage on level 4, counted them. 6 complete sets. That should be enough for several years if I managed them carefully. Food was calculated more precisely. I'd brought supplies to last 8 months with careful rationing. 3 meals a day would burn through it in 4 months. 2 meals a day would stretch it to 6. 1 large meal plus snacks would get me to 8 months. I chose the 1 meal plan. Eat a substantial dinner around 1800. Small breakfast of crackers or jerky. Minimal lunch. It wouldn't be comfortable, but I'd survive. Water was less concerning. The facility had a deep well that tapped into the aquifer. The water tasted mineral heavy and slightly metallic, but the filtration system made it safe. I had effectively unlimited water as long as the pumps worked. By day 10, I'd settled into the routine. The facility hummed around me. Generators running smoothly, air handlers pushing fresh air through the vents, lights on in the sections I used. Dark everywhere else. I was surviving, maintaining, existing, but I was also profoundly alone in a way I'd never experienced before. Day 15. I tried the radio for the first time since sealing the blast door. The facility had sophisticated communication equipment. Most of it was Cold War era and didn't work anymore. But there was a commercial radio receiver that still functioned. I'd brought a small battery-powered radio as well. Between them, I could scan most of the AM and FM bands, plus shortwave, plus emergency frequencies. I sat at the old communication console on level 1 and started scanning. Turned the dial slowly through the static. listening for voices. Most frequencies were dead, just carrier waves or complete silence. But I found a few broadcasts. AM 920, an automated emergency broadcast system looping the same message. This is a test of the emergency broadcast system. This is only a test. Over and over. Nobody had updated it to reflect the actual emergency. FM 94.5 static with occasional music breaking through. Like a radio station was still broadcasting on automation but barely functioning. FM 101.3. A voice. Weak and distant. Great Falls is lost. Hospitals overrun. If anyone can hear this, don't come here. The military pulled out 3 days ago. We're trapped in the civic center, running out of food. Please, then static. Shortwave 7.200 MHz military communications. Brief, coded transmissions I couldn't decipher. At least to different stations communicating, but I had no idea what they were saying or where they were. Emergency frequency 121.5 MHz. Silence, mostly. Then a burst of panicked voice. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is November-7-4-Tango-Charlie. We are going down. Both engines failed. We are static. I listened for 2 hours, scanning up and down the bands. The picture was clear. Civilization was collapsing. Great Falls was gone. Communications were failing. Whatever this infection was, it was winning. I turned off the radio, sat in the quiet hum of the facility. I'd made the right choice. Down here, I was isolated from all of that. Safe. Day 20. I saw them for the first time. The facility had periscopes, optical systems that let you see the surface from underground. There were 3 of them at different points around the complex, surfacing through armored housings that looked like ventilation caps from outside. I'd been checking them daily, watching the grassland, making sure nothing was approaching the facility. Everything had been quiet, empty landscape, occasionally a deer or antelope, nothing concerning. But on day 20, I saw figures through periscope too, 5 of them, moving across the grassland from the direction of the access road, human-shaped but wrong. That distinctive shambling walk I'd seen in the man on the Great Falls sidewalk. Watched them through the periscope optics. They were maybe a quarter mile from the facility, moving without apparent direction, wandering. One would walk in a straight line for a while, then turn 90 degrees for no reason, and walk that direction. Another stood still for 5 minutes, then suddenly ran 20 yards and stopped again. They were infected, the zombies, whatever we were calling them, and they were getting closer to my fortress. I tracked them for an hour. They meandered through the grassland, sometimes moving toward the facility, sometimes away. None of them seemed to notice the control center bunker or the blast door housing. They were just wandering. Eventually, 4 of them drifted away, following whatever internal compass guided them. But one kept coming, walked straight toward the facility, reached the chain link fence. The fence was 8 feet of chain link topped with barbed wire. The infected person stood at the fence for a moment, then started climbing. They could climb. I'd wondered about that. Now I knew. The infected made it over the fence, cutting themselves on the barbed wire. Drops of dark blood fell to the grass, but they didn't seem to notice. Just dropped to the other side and started walking toward the control center bunker. I switched to periscope 1, which gave me a view of the immediate area around the main entrance. The infected person approached the blast door housing, put hands on the concrete, pushed, pulled. It wasn't trying to get in with any intelligence or purpose, just reacting to the presence of a structure. The blast door was 8 tons of steel. No way was this thing getting through. After maybe 10 minutes, the infected person lost interest, wandered away, climbed back over the fence, leaving more blood on the barbed wire, disappeared into the grassland. I watched it go and felt my chest tighten. They knew the facility was here now, or at least one of them had found it. More would come. Eventually, they'd cluster around it. Maybe they'd figure out there was someone inside I was safe. The doors would hold, but the idea of being surrounded by them, trapped underground while they wandered the surface above me, made my skin crawl. Day 25. More of them came. I counted 12 through the periscopes over the course of the day. They approached from different directions. All displayed the same wandering behavior. Some climbed the fence, some just pressed against it. A few seemed to ignore the facility entirely and just walked past. But by evening, 3 of them were inside the fence line, just standing there, one near the blast door, to buy the old radio antenna. They weren't leaving, just standing, waiting for what? I couldn't tell that night. I couldn't sleep. Lay on my bunk listening to the generator hum and imagining I could hear them walking around on the surface above me, scratching at doors. pounding on concrete. I knew I couldn't hear them. 200 feet of earth between us. The blast door was sealed. They couldn't reach me, but knowing that logically didn't make me feel better. Day 30. The first system failure occurred. I was doing my morning rounds when I noticed the CO2 levels were elevated. Not dangerous yet, minus 1,100 parts per million, when normal was around 400, but high enough to cause mild cognitive impairment, headaches, fatigue. Checked the air handlers on level 4. They were running, fans turning, air moving through the system, but the CO2 wasn't getting scrubbed properly. I opened the scrubber unit and understood immediately. The chemical beds were saturated, black and crumbling instead of the pale gray of fresh beds. They'd been absorbing CO2 for who knew how long. Decades of ambient air exchange, even with the facility shut down. And they'd finally given up. I needed to replace them, and I needed to do it fast before CO2 levels got dangerous. I'd watched maintenance crews replace scrubber beds during my security visits. I knew the basic procedure, but I'd never done it myself. And this was not a process you wanted to screw up. Misinstalling the beds could result in air bypass that would let CO2 through, or it could block airflow entirely and suffocate me. I spent 4 hours on the replacement, shut down the air handlers, opened the scrubber unit. The old beds were heavy, 50 pounds each, and I had to wrestle them out of their housings. Set them aside, cleaned the housings, installed the new beds carefully, making sure they sealed properly in the mounts, closed everything up, restarted the air handlers, watched the CO2 monitors. The levels started dropping, 1000 ppm, 900, 800. By evening, they were back to 450. I'd successfully completed my first critical system repair. I'd also used up one of my 6 spare bed sets. I had 5 left. Figure each one lasted 6 months with just me breathing. That gave me 3 years of air. 3 years, that was my hard limit. After that, even if nothing else went wrong, I'd suffocate from CO to build up. The thought sat heavy in my mind. I had a countdown timer now, 3 years maximum, probably less if anything else failed. Day 40. I heard the first sounds that weren't mechanical. I was on level 3, reading. When I heard it, faint, coming from below, voices. I stopped reading, listened. The facility had its normal sounds, generator hum, air handler whoosh, water pumps clicking, but underneath, barely audible, I could hear talking. I went to the stairs, descended to level 4. The voices were louder here, definitely conversation, multiple people talking, coming from below. Level 5, still louder. The words weren't distinct, but the rhythm was clear, back and forth, dialogue. I reached level 6 and stopped. The voices were coming from level 7, the silo access level. I descended slowly. Level 7 was one of the sections I rarely visited, just a connector between the control center and the missile silo itself. Nothing down here I needed. The voices were clear now. A man and a woman, having a conversation about maintenance schedules, equipment checks. I couldn't quite make out the words, but the tone was calm, professional, like 2 co-workers discussing routine tasks. I reached level 7. The voices were coming from beyond the sealed silo access door. From inside the silo itself, I stood there listening to 2 people who couldn't possibly be there. The silo was sealed, had been for decades. Nobody could be in there. I was hallucinating. Isolation was starting to mess with my perception. My brain was generating auditory stimuli to fill the silence. I knew this was psychological, knew it wasn't real, but I stood there for 10 minutes listening anyway. The voices continued their calm conversation about things I couldn't quite understand. Finally, I turned and climbed back to level 3. Tried to focus on my book. The voices faded as I got farther away, but I knew they'd be back. This was just the beginning of my brain trying to cope with profound isolation. Day 45. Someone tried to break in. I was sleeping when the alarm woke me. A loud klaxon. I'd rigged sound if anyone triggered the perimeter motion sensors. I grabbed a flashlight and the rifle I'd kept close since the infected started clustering outside. Ran to level 1, checked the periscopes. People, living humans. 6 of them, working on the blast door. They had tools, a gas-powered cutting torch, an angle grinder. They were trying to cut through the blast door seal. I watched for a moment, assessing. They were organized, methodical, not infected. Actual survivors who'd found the facility and decided they wanted in. I went to the communication panel, The facility had external speakers for communicating with surface personnel during normal operations. I activated them. My voice boomed across the grassland, amplified and distorted by the speaker. This is a restricted military facility. You are in violation of federal law. Leave immediately or defensive measures will be initiated. They stopped working, looked around, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. One of them, a tall man with a heavy beard, shouted toward the blast door. "We know someone's in there. We've been watching for days. We saw you running the periscope checks." Shit, I'd been sloppy. Should have randomized my observation times. This facility is at capacity. No additional personnel can be accommodated. Leave now. The bearded man stepped closer to the blast door. "Don't give me that shit. We've counted the periscope movements. It's one person in there. Maybe two at most. This place can hold dozens. Let us in." "Negative. Leave immediately. We have kids. Women. We've been running for days. Those things are everywhere. We need shelter." My hand hovered over the intercom button. Kids, that complicated things. But 6 more people meant my supplies lasted 1 month instead of 8. Meant sharing space. Meant potential conflict. Meant trusting strangers. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. There's a town 12 miles west. Try there." The bearded man's voice got harder. "We came from there. The town's overrun. There's nowhere else. That's not my problem. Leave or I will take defensive action." One of the women in the group shouted, "You're going to let children die out here. What kind of monster are you?" The question hit harder than I'd expected. What kind of person was I becoming? The bearded man made a decision. He picked up the cutting torch again. "We're not leaving. You can't stop us. That door will cut eventually." He was wrong. The blast door was designed to resist nuclear weapons. A cutting torch would take days to make any meaningful progress. But they didn't know that. And if they kept trying, kept making noise, they'd attract every infected in the region. I made my choice. Went to the weapons locker I'd discovered on level 6. Selected one of the M16 rifles. Loaded a magazine. Went to the emergency escape shaft on level 5. The escape shaft was a secondary exit, installed in case the main entrance was blocked. A vertical tunnel with a ladder running from level 5 to a hatch on the surface about 50 yards from the main blast door. I'd never used it before. Wasn't even sure the surface hatch would open. I climbed 100 feet of ladder. My arms burned by the time I reached the top. Found the hatch wheel. Spun it. The hatch cracked open with a shower of dust and rust. I pushed it fully open. Poked my head out. Scanned the area. The group was still focused on the blast door. Their backs to me. I climbed out. Took a position behind a small concrete housing that covered the escape hatch. Raised the rifle. Aimed at the ground near the group's feet. Fired a 3-round burst. Dirt and grass exploded near the cutting torch operator. They all scrambled away, shouting, looking around wildly. Next burst won't be a warning shot. I shouted from my position, "Leave now." The bearded man spotted me. Started to bring up something he'd been carrying. Looked like a shotgun. I fired again, aimed for center mass. 3 rounds I missed intentionally, hitting the ground between us. But the message was clear. They ran, grabbed their kids, grabbed their tools, and fled to vehicles I could see parked at the fence line. Engines roared to life. They drove away fast, kicking up dust trails. I waited until they were out of sight. Then I descended back into the facility, sealed the escape hatch behind me, went to my bunk on level 3, sat down, put my head in my hands. I'd just fired a weapon at living people, driven away a group that included children, chosen my own survival over helping others. What kind of person did that make me? Day 50, I stopped asking that question. Stopped accepted what I'd become. Survivor. Nothing more. Nothing less. That the voices on level 7 became a regular occurrence. Sometimes it was the man and woman discussing maintenance. Sometimes it was a group of people having a meeting. Sometimes it was children playing. I knew none of it was real, but I'd started responding to them anyway. Having conversations with voices that only existed in my head. The isolation was breaking me, but I was still breathing, still maintaining systems, still alive. That's all that mattered. Day 60. Food rationing got serious. I'd been eating 1 meal a day plus snacks, but I reassessed my inventory and did the math. At current consumption, I'd run out in 4 months, not 8. I'd been eating more than I thought. I cut the snacks. 1 meal per day, period, and the meal got smaller. My weight started dropping. I could feel it in how my clothes fit, see it in my reflection in polished metal surfaces, no mirrors in the facility, but I could catch glimpses of myself gaunt, hollow-eyed. The physical manifestation of isolation and starvation, day 70. The oxygen crisis hit. I woke up dizzy, nauseous, breathing hard, but feeling like I wasn't getting enough air. Checked the monitors. Oxygen levels were at 18%. Should be 21%. Not immediately dangerous, but concerning. I checked the air handlers. They were running, but the intake filters were clogged. Months of operation without cleaning. The fans couldn't pull enough fresh air down from the surface. I had to clean the filters, which meant accessing the intake shafts, which meant going outside. I suited up like I was going to war. Heavy clothes, boots, the rifle, extra ammunition. Climbed the emergency escape shaft again. Emerged on the surface. Late afternoon, cold. The Montana winter was setting in, and they were there. The infected, maybe 20 of them scattered across the visible landscape, some inside the fence, some outside. When I emerged from the hatch, several turned toward me, started moving in my direction. I ran for the intake shaft housing. It was a concrete structure about 3 feet tall, like a large vent cap. Unlocked the access panel, started pulling out the filters. They were thick with dirt, dust, debris. I tossed them aside, started installing the spare filters I'd brought up. The infected were getting close, maybe 30 yards. Moving with that mindless persistence, I worked faster, got the last filter installed, locked the access panel, turned to run back to the escape hatch. They were between me and the hatch. 4 of them. Cutting me off, I brought up the rifle. Fired, one went down. Fired again. Another dropped. The remaining 2 kept coming. I ran, circled around them. Their movement was fast, but uncoordinated. I could outrun them over short distances. Reached the escape hatch, dropped through, pulled it shut above me, locked it from inside dark, climbed down, shaking, heart hammering. That had been too close, but the filters were changed. Oxygen levels would improve. I checked the monitors over the next few hours. O2 climbed back to 20%, then 21%. Crisis averted. Day 80, I realized I'd stopped counting days in any meaningful way. The number was just a number. Time had become meaningless down here. Day 100. The flooding started. I noticed water on the floor of level 8 during my morning rounds. Not a lot, just a puddle, but level 8 should be completely dry. I traced the water to its source. A crack in the foundation wall. Groundwater seeping through under pressure. I tried to seal it. Epoxy, hydraulic cement. Nothing worked. The pressure was too great. Water kept coming. I set up a pump to drain the water to a collection point. As long as the pump ran, the water level stayed stable. But if the pump failed, level 8 would flood, and the water would rise. Day 110, the water had risen despite the pump. Level 8 was now anchored. The pump couldn't keep up. I moved all essential supplies from level 8 to higher levels. Watched as the water slowly rose. Day 115, level 8 was completely flooded. 6 feet of water. Everything down there was ruined, but the water had stopped rising. Some equilibrium had been reached. I now had 7 usable levels instead of 8, and a constant reminder that the facility was deteriorating around me. Day 120. The fuel ran out. The generators sputtered and died in the middle of the night. The sudden silence woke me. No hum, no mechanical sounds, just nothing. The battery backup kicked in automatically. Emergency lights came on. Dim red LED. The air handlers switched to minimum power mode. Water pumps ran on reduced cycles. I had 72 hours before the batteries died completely. I spent those 3 days preparing for darkness. Gathered every light source I had. Chemical light sticks, LED flashlights, candles. Organized them by location. Calculated how long they'd last. Maybe 400 hours of light total. Less than 20 days after that complete darkness. Day 123, the batteries died. The facility went completely dark. I sat on my bunk on level 3, flashlight in hand, and watched the beam cut through absolute blackness. This was my new reality. Living in a tomb, 200 feet underground, no power, no light except what I carried. Air circulation by passive convection only. How long could I survive like this? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. Day 130, I'd adapted to the darkness, navigated by touch and memory, knew every step, every turn, every door. The air quality was declining without powered circulation. CO2 was building up in the lower levels. I moved to level 2, where natural convection brought fresher air down from the surface intakes. Day 140, food was running critically low. Maybe 2 weeks left. I started making trips to the surface to scavenge. Dangerous, but necessary. Each trip, I'd climb the escape shaft, emerge carefully, grab anything edible I could find in the abandoned control center building on the surface. Old MREs, canned goods, forgotten in storage. Anything. The infected were always there, always waiting, but I'd learned their patterns. Could avoid them, usually. Day 150, I heard the voices constantly now, all through the facility. Conversations in every room, people who weren't there, my brain filling the void with manufactured stimuli. I responded to them, had arguments with them, laughed at their jokes. I was completely insane, and I knew it, and I couldn't stop it. Day 160, I found a body on the surface, one of the group that had tried to break in. The woman who'd asked what kind of monster I was. She'd died maybe a week ago, frozen in the Montana winter. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. I stood over her body and felt nothing. Not guilt, not sadness, nothing. I'd become something that couldn't feel anymore. Day 170, level 7 flooded. The water was rising again. Now I had 6 usable levels. Day 180, I made my decision. I couldn't stay. The facility was dying. I was dying. I had maybe 30 days before starvation or suffocation killed me. I had to leave. Try to reach Fort Harrison, the refugee center I'd heard about on the radio months ago. Day 190, I prepared to leave. Gathered supplies, planned my route. Day 200. I opened the blast door for the first time in 200 days. The hydraulics were dead. No power to move 8 tons of steel. I had to use the manual crank. Turned it for hours, muscles screaming. The door moved inches at a time. Finally, a gap, 2 feet wide, enough to squeeze through. I stepped out into the control center, climbed the stairs to the surface, opened the door. Winter air hit me. Sunlight blinded me after 200 days in darkness. I stumbled outside. The infected were everywhere, dozens of them. They saw me, started moving toward me. Dropped my pack, just ran, north across the grassland. They followed. I made it maybe 2 miles before I collapsed. Exhaustion, starvation, months underground, lay in the snow, waited for them to reach me. Heard an engine, a vehicle, military Humvee, stopped next to me. A soldier looked down. Fort Harrison Patrol, you, the guy from the silo. We've been watching your periscope movements for months. Figured you'd eventually come out. Come on, we've got you. They pulled me into the vehicle, drove me to Fort Harrison. To safety. I'd survived 240 days in a nuclear missile silo. 240 days of darkness, isolation, and slow system failure. I'd chosen the deepest fortress, and learned that no bunker is deep enough when you're alone with your own mind. If this story changed how you think about underground survival, about isolation versus death, hit subscribe. This is the darkest horror we've created. Comment, could you survive even 100 days in complete darkness? Stay above ground, stay sane, and remember, the safest tomb is still a tomb.